Hi, my name is Zio Alvarez. I'm a fourth year MArch in the Department of Architecture here at MIT and a member of NOMAS. I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing our guest for the 2021 NOMAS Lecture, Joseph Kunkel. To start, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, saying that MIT NOMAS acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land which MIT occupies is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts peoples. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of these territories, as well as the ongoing processes of colonialism and dispossession in which we and our institution are implicated. Beyond the stolen territory which we physically occupy, MIT has long profited from the sale of federal lands granted by the Morrill Act, territories stolen from 82 tribes, including the Greater and Little Osage, Chippewa, and Omaha peoples. As we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land from time immemorial, we also acknowledge that we have not spent much time as an organization thinking about what comes next. Borrowing language from our peers in DUSP's Indigenous Environmental Planning course this semester, we can say at this point that we seek to indigenize our institution in the field of architecture, offer space, and leave indigenous peoples in more empowered positions. As a student organization, we can also say that we stand in solidarity with our peers and classmates of the Native American Student Association and American Indian Science and Engineering Society here at MIT and support them in their efforts for justice and care in our campus community and beyond. For a little bit about NOMAS, NOMAS is the MIT chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. We are committed to the idea that our community can be strengthened by the active practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Department of Architecture. We champion diversity in design by calling for equality and fairness in our education, celebrating excellence in our discipline, and providing community members with resources to develop personally and professionally. Representing NOMAS tonight, along with myself, in conversation with Joseph, are Amanda Ugoji and Naria Filiposian. Amanda is a designer and artist interested in the potential for interdisciplinary design to act as a conduit for justice. She is currently a first-year MArch at MIT, and before coming here, she worked in film, urban planning, and community engagement. In her research, she investigates the social industrial complexes that dominate economic structures in the United States, the spatialization of memory, Black feminist practices, and the historical role of women in architecture. Her goal as a practitioner is to be able to combine her own knowledge and community with the knowledge and experiences of others to design answers to contextually specific problems. Naria Filiposian is a third-year MArch student here in the department and a member of NOMAS. Born and raised in Armenia, Naria received a bachelor's degree in philosophy and architecture from Bennington College. Her current research looks at the decline and disappearance of skill-based building practices and craftsmanship on building sites as a byproduct of globalization. Naria's thesis is concerned with the recovery of Armenian stonemasonry techniques, a millennia-old cultural practice, as a way to restore lost cultural currency. As we in the department have been pushed apart by COVID and pulled together in solidarity and grief, we as a student body have been thinking about architecture's role in spatial justice and how the tools we learn as practitioners can be used to support the movements for justice and self-determination central to many of the communities we call home. We're excited about Joseph's work because it exemplifies the ways that beautiful design and conscientious architectural practice can be an agent for transformational change, and because he pushes the boundaries of what it means to be an engaged practitioner in our discipline. To give an intro to him, Joseph Kunkel is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and a principal at Mass Design Group, where he directs the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He's a community designer and educator focused on sustainable development practices throughout Indian country. His work includes exemplary Indian housing projects and processes nationwide. This research work has been developed into emerging best practices, leading to an online Healthy Homes roadmap for tribal housing development funded by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development's Policy Development and Research Office. His professional career has centered on community-based design, materials research, fabrication, and construction. In 2018, Joseph was awarded an Obama Fellowship for his work with indigenous communities. Joseph is a fellow of the inaugural class of the Civil Society Fellowship, a partnership of ADL and the Aspen Institute, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. We, NOMAS, the broader MIT architecture community, and all of you tuning in right now or later, are incredibly fortunate to share time and space with him this evening, and we're looking forward to both his talk and our subsequent conversation. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the introduction. Looking forward to this evening's conversation and It's a kind introduction. So I'm excited to share some of the work that we have been working on over the past 10 plus years. Let me go ahead and share my screen and get this moving. Pardon my technical transition here. So this evening, and I guess I'm assuming you can see the screen now. So great. So this idea around I wanted to share with you this kind of idea around bridging boundaries, this kind of opportunity for thinking about architecture for a wealth building and equitable opportunity to kind of create and develop an Indian country, and this idea around native, non-native collaboration. But first, I wanted to kind of start with this initial question, which I talk about often, is this kind of idea: what are we, how are we kind of thinking about the lands in which we're kind of inhabiting, situating, kind of thinking about as we kind of design, habitate, and occupy these lands, right? What does the rural have in common with the urban, with the kind of the lands, lakes, plains, high desert landscapes? And of course, you might be able to kind of understand what these all are, and kind of understanding these as indigenous lands, I think, is important. Your kind of land acknowledgement, kind of grounding us in the spaces that we are, especially when it comes to kind of connecting virtually. Where are we all calling in from? How do we acknowledge these places as designers, as architects, as planners, as engineers, is all really important, because this is Indian country. It's where we celebrate our cultures, our ways of being since time immemorial. This too is Indian country, right? This kind of senseless placelessness of housing that we kind of relate to Indian country, quote unquote HUD housing that doesn't necessarily replace or represent a community, culture, or place. This too is Indian country, right? Manhattan Island, the kind of financial capital of the world, where a large amounts of wealth is created, and yet how do we kind of acknowledge the indigenous peoples that called Manhattan Island home? Similar to this nation's capital, right? These lands of the Piscataway, who are not a federally recognized tribe, yet this is our national capital, where the powers that be create legislation and create policy, and really set the tone for how we kind of live and operate in this country. This too is also Indian country, right? Your land acknowledgement, acknowledging kind of the kind of homelands of Boston and the kind of Northeast. And I'd also kind of lift up the lands I'm calling in from today. I'm acknowledging with gratitude Oge Poge, the original Tewa name for Santa Fe, which means white shell water place, on whose unceded traditional territories I call you in from this evening. We honor these people, past, present, and future, along with the many indigenous peoples who inhabit, and continue to hold sacred and steward these lands. It's important to, as designers, as architects, as planners, to acknowledge the places in which we build, design, and plan. And so these are native lands, these are indigenous lands, and as a kind of point of departure, how do we acknowledge that with our connection to place? And so why are we here? I question that for all those that are kind of chiming in and zooming in this evening. Why are we here? Why are you here? And I'd start with this kind of notion: architecture is never neutral. It either heals or hurts. Our mission is to research, build, and advocate for a design that promotes health, justice, and human dignity. And when it relates to Indian country, I think historically, the built environment, the architecture that we find on many reservations and many tribal communities does not kind of relate to a sense of culture, a sense of place, a sense of being. Historically, it has hurt our communities. And so how do we reframe that? How do we really think clearly about how an architecture can lift up a sense of culture, a sense of people, a sense of identity? And I think much of what we're trying to do in our work is really reframe that conversation around how can we leverage architecture as a means for healing. And just to kind of ground us in this kind of space and how we think about Indian country and how we're kind of working, I think this information is really important to lift up. 33% of Indian country lives in poverty versus the national average of 12.5%. On any given day, 90,000 Native Americans are homeless. There's an immediate need of 200,000 units of housing in Indian country. And yet our budget, this is kind of a little dated, but according to the 29 Indian Housing Block Grant, these are the HUD funds that our tribal housing authorities or tribally designated housing entities or tribal housing programs get to work with. This is the kind of annual, about an average of an annual budget that gets allocated towards affordable housing development. That in relationship to the previous year has kind of it goes up and down according to our congressional budget. But just thinking about that in context of how we think about this work is equity issue, is a justice issue, and how do we start to kind of understand this number as it relates to construction and development. If we were to think about inflation, and if we thought about inflation since these policies were put into place in 1995, the Native American Self-Determination Assistance and Housing Act, or NAHASDA, this number would be around 900 million, right? But yet this number still is not big enough. If we were to kind of take that $674 million and break it up among our 574 federally recognized tribes evenly, although as a side note, we don't evenly allocate our budget among the 574 tribes. But if we were to just do some quick math, it would be about $1.15 million per year per tribe, right? If we were to even break that down even further, that equates to about 2 to 3 homes per year per tribe. If we were to kind of then go back and think about that 200,000 unit housing gap, it would take about 117 years to really kind of build for that gap in housing that we see, 117, 120 years. And that is, that's a inequity right there, right? How do we start to think about design, construction, planning? How do we rethink ways in which we can fund, finance, and build housing in an equitable way that lifts up the identities of our first peoples prior to Western contact? And just as another side note, when we think about philanthropy and philanthropy's role in Indian housing or tribal housing, 0.3% of all philanthropy in the United States goes to Native-led organizations or community-driven projects, yet Indian country makes up 2% of this nation's population. And so how do we start to readjust and think about ways in which we can build better relationships with our non-Native partners? Because if we don't, we'll end up continuing to get housing that doesn't reflect culture, community, or place, doesn't reflect the identities of the people that live and occupy these lands since time immemorial. And so the question is not what is the cost of architecture, but what is the cost of not having architecture? So our team is really kind of focused on researching, trying to understand ways in which we can build the capacity of Indian country, providing technical assistance trainings, working on the ground with tribal housing authorities, and really working towards ways in which we can lift up the power of design and the role of design in affordable housing development and community development, and ways in which we can build the next generation or support the next generation of thought leaders in this space. Because if we don't, again, if we're not working in these places, in these spaces, and with these populations, we'll continue to get an architecture or a built environment that is placeless. And that's important to kind of lift up and understand in context to how we think about place. Prior to Western contact, we were a nation of, or a country or a place of 20 million, right? Prior to Western contact, there were about 20 million indigenous peoples that called North America home. That compared to today, 5.4 million that belong to 574 federally recognized tribes is in itself an injustice. And so how did we get to this point in time? How did we get to this moment in history where we're kind of at this crux of a 200,000 unit housing gap? And so really quickly, prior to Western contact, we did have an architecture that reflected community culture in place, right? From the Southwest with the Pueblo communities to the Plains to the Pacific Northwest and Northeast and Southeast, we had an architecture that reflected the climates and the communities in which our indigenous peoples inhabited, right? The longhouses, the teepees, the earth lodges, the kind of earthen construction buildings made out of mud adobe. This architecture really reflected the nuances of these communities, of these places, and it was a real sense of community. When we think about the teepee encampments, which in essence is an urban form, right? The ability to kind of rely on one another, or in a similar way, the Pueblo villages that have a center space or a plaza that really kind of where cultural activities happen. All these places really reflected the identities of the peoples that inhabited these places. And then fast forward 300 years, there's a large time gap in there. But once we start to think about federal policy and the ways in which federal policy or United States federal policy started to kind of break down that sense of community from the Dawes Act, Senator Dawes, who basically kind of sold off land and really kind of started to instill this notion of capitalism or capitalistic society on tribal communities. That was something that really started to break down this sense of community and really lifted up the individual rather than the community. Fast forward to the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, to the 1937 Housing Act, where HUD, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, became the developer for housing in Indian country, along with many other communities, right? It wasn't just about Indian country, but we saw this happen in rural America, in urban America, and ways in which that policy really set forth this kind of copy paste process of where we see housing that you might see in Montana, a house that kind of doesn't reflect community culture or place. That same housing plan or that same housing unit can be found in rural Arizona or New Mexico. And so that 1937 Housing Act started to kind of really break down even further the sense of community or sense of place. And then fast forward to 1956 with the Indian Relocation Act and understanding how natives were being taken off reservation and placed into communities that weren't their own, right? A further breakdown of the indigenous identity and ways in which the breakdown of the native, the indigenous person even was furthered. But while I kind of dwell on a lot of the negatives, there's also positives, right? And so as we get into the 90s with this idea around self-determination and sovereignty, you have many natives leading policy and rethinking how historically policy didn't serve Indian country. And in the 90s with the HUD Section 184 loan guarantee program, and in 1996 during the Clinton administration, where the Native American Housing and Self-Determination Act was passed, which really lifted up sovereignty and self-determination, which really moved housing authorities or really created the establishment of housing authorities or tribally designated housing entities to be the developer of housing, moving and pushing out the 1937 Housing Act. And so this idea around self-determination and the HASDA really empowered tribes to be the developers that pushed forward community culture in place. And so what does that mean to be in charge of developing your own housing as a sovereign nation? And then fast forward again to 2012 with the Hearth Act, or the Helping Expedite and Advance Responsible Tribal Home Ownership, right? All these policies start to kind of lift up that sense of self-determination and sovereignty. And now we're starting to kind of move towards that idea around what does it mean to be building housing that reflects community culture in place? What does it mean to be building a Northern Cheyenne house or a home? What does it mean to be building a Navajo home that really reflects the kind of nuances of Navajo culture? And I think that's something that was kind of set forth in the 90s, and we still continue to explore and try and understand to today. And that gets to this kind of conversation of, well, now since we have policies and financial mechanisms to think about housing, how do we start to kind of establish and close that gap of 200,000 units of housing? And so I'm going to go and dive into an example, which is a project that I worked on early on when I moved out to New Mexico with the Kiowa Pueblo, or the Santo Domingo Pueblo, also known as the Santo Domingo Pueblo, a Pueblo village that is about 40 minutes south of Santa Fe, about 40 minutes north of Albuquerque, in a rural place along Route 25. Route 25 connects both Santa Fe and Albuquerque, but really trying to understand how historically the historic village, which you kind of see outlined here, how the village could kind of set parameters for what future contemporary housing in a Kiowa way could be reflected in a contemporary method, way of kind of establishing planning opportunities, design opportunities, and construction opportunities to lift up the kind of essence or the culture of Kiowa Pueblo. I was fortunate enough to kind of work within the housing authority for 3 years on a 3-year grant to really establish and work within a development office that kind of lifts up the power of design, and vice versa, allow me to understand how I could use the tools of development, the kind of financial tools of development, to really push forward housing as it relates to Santo Domingo or Kiowa Pueblo. And so this is really early on, and while we kind of started to realize this after the project, but really trying to understand ways in which the visioning, planning, and establishing a mission for a project really set the tone for an opportunity to have holistic and long-term impact within the community, right? How do we better serve a community? How do we kind of engage with the community to really ask the questions, what does a Santo Domingo house look like here? And how can we design such a house that lifts up community culture in place? And that visioning planning process really allowed us to establish what exemplary design could do for Santo Domingo, and working with the community. And then pushing the bounds of trying to understand, well, at what point do we kind of set in motion the notion of design and move forward a process that lifts up construction practices and understanding what affordable housing could do. And I just want to kind of also have add a side note here and trying to talk a little bit about establishing those visions and that mission really early in the process allowed us to create those opportunities for potential impact. As we got closer and closer to construction, those notions around design started to fall wayside, right? We started to implement those design decisions into a construction process, and as we got closer and closer to construction, we started to realize that design slowly starts to kind of wean off, right? We have early on in the visioning and planning process, design has a huge potential to influence the overall project. As we get closer to construction, design starts to have less and less opportunity, and we start to rely more on the construction process. And then post construction, post development, it is really about the kind of notion around operation and maintenance, right? The kind of longest phase of a building, of a house's life cycle is the O&M, operation and maintenance, the kind of habitation of a housing unit, right? And so ensuring that we really create a sense of place, a sense of home, ensures that ability to kind of sustain a house, to think about a house's life cycle costs, really gets put into the hands of the renter, of the homeowner. And so ensuring once we kind of depart and become less and less part of the process, we have to ensure that we've kind of passed on that capacity to the end user to operate, maintain, and take care of the home, the house, the building. And this goes for not just housing, this goes for any kind of building that we work on. And if we were to kind of think about the built environment, how are architects, how are engineers, how are planners preparing for that kind of post-occupancy phase of a building's life? And so at Santo Domingo, Kiowa Pueblo, to really work with the community became the kind of essence of the community engagement process, right? I might be native, I'm a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and was now southeastern Montana, but I'm still an outsider to the Pueblo communities here in New Mexico. And so how was I working with the tribal youth? how was I kind of passing my knowledge of architecture or sharing my knowledge of architecture, planning and design, engineering to the next generation. They know their language, Keres. I didn't at the time, and I still don't know Keres fluently or so on. And they can talk to their elders in their traditional language. They can share complex ideas in their own language. And so by me sharing my knowledge, my technical knowledge with the youth, they in turn kind of shared their knowledge with me, and creating that relationship became really important for me to understand the conditions of the village, ways in which we can learn from those conditions, and hopefully create a future opportunity for ways in which architecture could be lifted up in a way that really reflects this place in particular. And so passing on skill sets, drafting skill sets, GIS skill sets, ways in which we could let them kind of be in the driver's seat to some extent, and be empowered to understand their community in a different way, allowed me to understand their community from a culture in a more cultural way. And so we ended up with a really easy exercise, or semi-easy exercise, or a task to kind of survey the entire village, right? Try and understand homes that were uninhabited, that were in poor condition, that needed some TLC, or just right investment from the housing authority. It was a way to kind of be proactive rather than reactive. Historically, community members would go to the housing authority and ask for support. Well, this is an opportunity for the housing authority to be more proactive in a way in which lifts up what the housing authority could be doing within the community. And then as we started to kind of survey the village, we started to realize that there's another opportunity here to define from a sovereignty standpoint, or from a community standpoint, what might be historic as it relates to the community, right? And so what this image shows you here is that blue boundary box is the National Park Service's historic boundary box, so places of historic significance. And so all over the many pueblos here, the 19 pueblos in New Mexico, many have this National Historic Boundary box, which is randomly placed, right? And so if you look at the bottom right corner, that blue line goes through a home. And so in that instance, does that mean one half the home is historic and the other half is not? And so how is that being defined, and who is defining that? And so through this surveying and through this surveying exercise, we started to really try and let the community to define, as it relates to the community, what is historic and what is not. And you start to kind of get a sense of the potential around of holding knowledge, of creating the kind of sense of knowledge, and translating that information, or that more technical information, into your own cultural knowledge, and lifting that up in a way of empowering the community. And so that kind of transition of power, I thought, was pretty impactful from a technical standpoint. And these are just some images of how the village expanded over time, and really trying to get at the essence of what was culturally significant, and what was and how might the housing authority leverage its Indian Housing Block Grant, the kind of main sources of funding, to invest in rehabilitation of old homes, of historic homes, and allow them to guide and allocate those funds in a way that really lifts up the kind of cultural nuances of the community. And these are just some images of homes that were in good, fair, poor, severe condition. And like I said earlier, a way for the housing authority to be more proactive about how they allocate the Indian Housing Block Grant Fund, or even apply for Indian Community Development Block Grant Funds, which is a competitive process in which federal funds are allocated. And then we even get to today with the CARES Act funding, where tribes are competitively going after competitive Indian Housing Block Grant funds. And so these proactive tools to empower the community to be in charge of their own destiny, I think, is part of the work that we have done and we continue to do with tribal communities across the country. And so this idea of creating a network of partnerships, right, trying to share knowledge, scale the outcomes, and understand the potential impacts that we have within the community was what we saw our goals are, right, or what our goals were within the community, right, connecting practice with government, with academia and philanthropy, and understanding the roles in which the various tribal programs, tribal youth, the health department, government, council, and elders were part of those conversations. And so in which way were we trying to connect the dots between the various entities that were part of these processes? And in many ways, try and demystify the development process within the community. All right, and demystify and talk about the complex processes that were going on. Right, that it's not just as easy as building a home. You need to understand the federal programs in play. You need to understand where those dollars are coming from to build your homes, and ways in which you could leverage academic knowledge and student and undergraduate, graduate knowledge to support some of the initiatives that the Pueblo wanted to lift up. And so, again, going back to this diagram, this idea of really understanding what is the role of design in community development, and trying to understand ways in which we could achieve design in every one of these areas, and think about it as a design problem from the visioning phase all the way through the use phase of the post-occupancy. Can we be designing operation and maintenance manuals that lift up long-term sustainability within the community? Can we kind of build wealth and really transition housing rentership to home ownership, and really create an opportunity for community members to become homeowners, and move and elevate from a renter to a homeowner? When I kind of transitioned that language from renter to homeowner, that's historically how we have built wealth in this country, right? Ways in which that is historically not been afforded to natives in general. It's very similar to redlining that we saw in African American communities and white communities and urban areas, where today still the big banks don't fully lend on reservation lands. And so what does it mean to be building infrastructure and creating a housing market and housing opportunities on land, on tribal trust lands? And that's kind of where we're at today, is trying to find design opportunities to think about that in a culturally contextual way. And so this idea around knowing your population you're working with, knowing the audience, who are you working with, became really important. And then in many ways, because I was in a quote unquote development office, a community development office, the Tribal Housing Authority, knowing those dollars that we had access to, that I had access to, became empowering, right? Being able to understand how to pull those levers to leverage that information over time became critical for overall project success. And during that time, we started to establish after the fact. This was kind of all came together as we were kind of moving through this development process, but we started to realize that we weren't necessarily the architects, right? The communities were the architects of their own vision, and really trying to understand how that vision was an opportunity for a long-term commitment to change, right? If we're able to instill that vision within tribal elders, within the community members, they had something to empower themselves to understand that that vision could potentially be a way to think about change, to think about change in their housing, to think about change in their community, and do it in a way that really lifts up their values. And this idea around engaging, right? Engaging the community to understand, to gain clarity and understand this kind of notion or sense of place, right? Empowering them with the knowledge that allows us to make critical decisions, and then ensuring that we're getting participation from the entire community, right? Ensuring that maybe some surveys or community walks includes only tribal youth or only tribal elders, or at times maybe the entire community, and trying to understand how we are structuring those community engagement meetings, right? Sometimes, yes, it's at the community center. Sometimes it's at the library. Sometimes it's in the morning, the afternoon. Maybe we're hosting a lunch or a dinner. or a weekend basketball tournament. And so in what ways can we kind of rethink the community engagement process and ensure that there's ways to get the entire community to participate in the work that we're doing? And so this idea around designing with community helps to create equity, equality, and positive social change became the motto, or the way in which we thought about this work. And I underscore with, because in this sense, we're not designing for, right? This idea of as architect as the all-knowing person with the knowledge was basically in many ways pushed out the door, right? We really saw this as a notion around creating and designing with community, not for community. And so as we thought about it, and as we engaged, as we got community participation, we were able to really start to then leverage the design process to define what was possible, right? Understanding the opportunities around recreational space, trail space, the ability to create sidewalks and infrastructure that historically hadn't been part of community development projects in the past within Santo Domingo. And this idea around leveraging the past, right? Understanding that this is an urban form, that like, this is an aerial. So if you were to Google Santo Domingo Pueblo or Kiwa Pueblo and pull up some images, this is one of the images you'll probably find on Google, right? This is an urban form. There's a density here that really reflects the cultural nuances of this place. And so how does that start to inform a contemporary or a modern way of building from a planning standpoint? And then thinking about the future, right? How do we get inspired but don't copy paste the ideas of the village, because there's culturally significant nuances there, and how do we translate that into in a new way? How do we kind of take and replicate that density and that sense of community into a new form? And while we were kind of investing in rehabilitation projects and providing safe, healthy housing within the village, we also needed to think about designing new housing, right? How do we go from investing in the community, in the village, but also think about new opportunities for housing development outside of the village? And so this idea around, and this really came from listening to the community, right? So this is Robert Tenario, a well-known Santo Domingo potter, whose livelihood is made from making these pots, right? And how do we start to kind of lift up his notion of making? We knew that if we were going to build housing, new housing, that we needed to reflect and build spaces and places that allow community members to do the practice and work that they need to do to provide food on the table. And so if we had an opportunity to build housing that reflects the cultural nuances of Santo Domingo, we knew that we needed to potentially start thinking about artisan spaces, making spaces, spaces that really allow for their abilities to create wealth, to build on. And so some initial sketches put forth that maybe every unit of affordable housing gets a detached studio, right? This idea around placing artisan studios or maker spaces that associate with the units became really, really important. And then maybe pushing the bounds, and that kind of pushed the bounds of what this idea was, right? We were really fortunate enough during the design phase of this project to get a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Pew Charitable Trust program, the Health Impact Project, to do a health impact assessment. And we realized that because many of these family members, these artisans, these makers were creating in their households, in their living rooms, in their kitchens, on their dining room tables, that was contributing those kind of, when you grind down shells, when you kind of make your work, you end up putting particulate, sometimes dangerous particulate, into the air, contributing to a bad indoor air quality. And so from a design standpoint, how do you, it just made sense to detach that program, those program elements, outside of the main unit. And so how would we do that? and create these kind of artist sheds in some way. And so after many different iterations, we ended up thinking about a 41 unit housing development. Every one of the 41 units, which ranged from a 1, 2, and 3 bedroom unit, had an associated scaled art studio. So 41 units of housing, 41 art studios. And because this was co-located next to what is the rail runner, this idea around this this kind of southeast unit, furthest unit from the rail runner, was about a 5-minute walk to the rail runner. And remember when I kind of introduced this project between Santa Fe, New Mexico and Albuquerque, New Mexico, that rail runner connects to both Santa Fe and Albuquerque. That's this kind of idea around a rural transit oriented development to be able to access the art markets in Albuquerque, to access the art markets in Santa Fe, to access the Santa Fe Indian School or the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. This idea around what does it mean to be building a rural housing development that is connected to public infrastructure. And then planning down the road 15, 20 years, the trading post, we were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Economic Development Administration, the EDA, to renovate the trading post as a potential way of rethinking what the trading post was, and really using it as a place for a sales point for these artisans, right? So at some point, maybe outside visitors, non-natives, come to the village and buy locally rather than the community members having to go to Albuquerque and Santa Fe. So really thinking strategically about how this housing project would kind of be lifting up those kind of cultural nuances of the community. And then thinking even further that this rental development would hopefully be a stepping stone into home ownership, right? The ability to kind of think about using the rent as a ways or a means to build credit and showcase that you can pay a month-to-month rental fee, and that hopefully will serve as a potential way of thinking about saving and putting down for a mortgage and building a home, which phase 2 of this project was to think about home ownership, which is actually under construction now. And so these are just some initial after construction kind of final images of the development itself. So 1, 2, 3 bedroom units. With this development, we kind of followed and got this to be certified Enterprise Green Communities, which is an affordable housing green standard, a 3,000 square foot community center, which served as both a multi-purpose space, a warming kitchen, a child daycare, a flex space for the community to celebrate. And then of course, the artisan, right? The ability to kind of make in these spaces became pretty crucial. So really quickly, I know I got maybe a few more minutes, but I wanted to jump into a more recent project that kind of really lifts up this idea around expedited or emergency housing that reflects how you might be doing this in a way that how you might be creating housing in an expedited way under emergency circumstances. And so this work with Big Valley Rancheria was a project that we were kind of brought on midsummer 2020 in response to the COVID pandemic, and trying to find ways in which we could deliver housing and to the tribal elders of the community to ensure that they had some place to go. When we think about homelessness in Indian country, it isn't necessarily people on the street. It's more or less overcrowding that we see. So a home that was designed for a family of 4 or 5 sometimes has 18, 20, 25 people living in it. And so that's like an ideal environment for the spread of COVID, right? When everybody's kind of crammed into these kind of small spaces. And so how do we design a housing typology where elders can go and retreat to so that they can be safe? And why our elders are cultural bearers. They kind of they're the holders of our cultural knowledge. And so how do we ensure that that is kind of shared? And so we had a very short timeline. We needed to, at the time, we needed to build, well, we needed to spend down the CARES Act funding, right? December 31st, 2020, the funds were going to go away if we didn't spend them down. And so basically we had to get housing implemented rather quickly. And so we worked with a housing modular manufacturers in Los Angeles to really think about ways of delivering housing that could be sustainable, that could be long-term, that would be energy efficient. And so all those priorities became essential for us to kind of think more creatively about. And also creating a sense of community for our elders, right? And this idea around creating these kind of common spaces for our elders to connect to one another in a safe way, right? Creating outdoor spaces so that we can really think creatively. And while we didn't necessarily design these units, we designed the ways in which the landscapes came together, and thinking more down the line, how can we actually be working with a manufacturer to design culturally responsive, culturally sensitive housing that really reflects the nuances of the community in this case. And so, and we think it could potentially be an opportunity for us to think about replacing the single wide or double wide, right? Especially when it comes to rural housing, where a majority of rural housing tends to be trailer housing, which actually devalues over time rather than increases in over time. And so what does it mean to actually be investing long-term in this emergency housing so that it does actually value over time and increase in value over time, sorry. And these are just some images as it relates to now. Right now, we're hooking up the infrastructure, we're working on the electrical utilities, and just thinking more critically about how this could become an example for future housing, not only at Big Valley, but in the Dakotas, in the plains, in the Southwest, and potentially rural America as a whole. So it's an exciting project, and we're really looking forward to seeing how this expands over time. And so again, this is the community that we're lifting up and really thinking critically about ways in which they can be part of these processes. And so right now we're, after this project is completed, we'll be moving into an assessment of all the homes and try and understand where is there an opportunity to think about this as it scales up. So I want to kind of leave you all with this kind of question. So why are we here? Why are you all here? Why are you all doing the work that you're doing? Why are you studying architecture, planning, design? And I'll kind of answer that from my own perspective. Why am I here? And it's mainly because of this population, this generation, right? It's our tribal youth that we're designing with in mind. They're the ones that will be the kind of stakeholders and bearers of whatever we're building today. And so if we're doing our job right, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren will have safe places, healthy places, sustainable homes to be living in when it comes to future population. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Hello, thank you so much for that lecture and your insights and your work so far. We're going to start off the discussion with some questions from the audience. One of which is, could you please speak to the translation of framing culturally specific design with the American standard needed for funding? I'm thinking of the example where you had to frame the artist space specifically as storage. Is there a cost in relation to doing this? Is there a cost to the space? Do you have to change, air quality and things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a funding perspective, when we knew we needed to do it. We knew we needed to. It would have been. We needed to understand how to provide spaces for creating, period, right? We knew it was going to happen, so why not design it? And then the later conversation was, well, how do we communicate that we're going to be designing design studios or artist studios to federal entities or to to investors, right? This is affordable housing. Why are you designing an art studio? Well, I think we just, in many ways, reframed what that was. So we ended up in the performa calling it a storage shed. So understand, and the storage shed was in relationship to the size of the housing unit. So just as an example, a smaller housing unit got a smaller shed or art shed. A larger housing unit got a larger art shed. And we were waiting to see if we would get any pushback from the investor from the New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority, and we didn't. And it moved forward. And I forgot to mention, in that project in particular, something that helped set the tone was funding from two arts organizations. The National Endowment for the Arts was an early investor in the project, right? They provided a $100,000 planning grant, an Our Town grant, to help us understand how to connect the dots. And then a year and a half later, we got a significant contribution from Art Place America, an arts initiative that really kind of focused on creative placemaking. And so those two substantial funding sources allowed us to either spin our wheels a little bit, allowed us to explore design opportunities and potentials, and really kind of push the bounds of what affordable housing on the reservation could look like.
Thank you so much, Joseph. It's been wonderful to kind of be on second kind of series of conversations with you, continuing the kind of what we started on Tuesday with a smaller setting. And you kind of touched upon this point, like at various moments, both today and on Tuesday, that these principles of land ownership and property that are employed by HUD are largely Western understandings of what land is for, how it's distributed, valued, or taken care of, which seem almost like oblivious to indigenous understandings of how land is understood. And so I'm wondering, what is the kind of, in your mind, the cultural cost that comes with the employment of these real estate principles through like HUD housing in reservations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of complexity when it comes to understanding affordable housing development on tribal lands. And I would say that a lot of people reference HUD housing as a negative, and to some extent it can be considered a negative piece historically. I think HUD understands, and maybe I'm putting words into HUD's mouth, but I think they're starting to understand, or they are understanding the opportunities to kind of pass the power over to tribal communities. Hence why you have the passing of the Native American Self-Determined Assistance and Housing Act, or NAHASDA, and putting the tribe in the developer's seat rather than HUD. And so today, when I look at quote unquote HUD housing on reservations that's being built today, I kind of question and pose and challenge tribal leaders. Like, yes, this might be funded through HUD, but you are the developer. And so what does it mean to be pushing the bounds of what housing could potentially be for your community? And really thinking about that holistically. Now, that's sometimes a short-sighted way of approaching the conversation. I would say that there's other complexities like tribal trust land, right? When you go on to tribal trust land, that's, while it might be Northern Cheyenne trust land, it's being held in trust by the federal government, right? And so this is technically federal land and being held by the federal government because tribes can't take care of it, right? It needs to be held in trust because tribes don't know what, and that's also, again, maybe a short-sighted way of looking at it. But how can we use something like the Hearth Act to really empower tribes to take advantage of building on their lands and bypassing. And so what the Hearth Act actually does is allow tribes to bypass the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is actually under the Department of the Interior, and allow them to put land leases and execute land leases on their own rather than having to go through a federal entity. And so that's another way of empowering tribes to take advantage of development. And then further on, I mean, I'd say that when it comes to kind of cultural nuances, when we think about trusts, I'd say in some ways tribes are already kind of at that kind of progressive state of mind, right? When we think about affordable housing in urban areas, many people talk about co-housing or putting housing, affordable housing into trusts so that the kind of value of land is kind of spread across all the units, right? And so in some ways, tribes are already at that stage. Now, how do we start to kind of push the bounds of what housing could be? And in many ways, can housing on reservation land start to influence how we think about affordable housing off reservation land, right? Can we influence how we think about housing in non-native communities, how we think about construction and sustainability? I think we can learn a lot from the work going on in Indian country and the exemplary work that we see happening.
That's really a perfect transition to the next question, which is, you spoke to the incorporation of traditional and culturally specific design without copying and pasting directly from the past. What does it look like when the past is built, or when the past built environment was designed specific to a migratory economy that cannot exist in the region anymore? For example, in some of the Native Alaskan communities. And then more broadly, how does one deal with the tension of incorporating culturally specific design meant for a certain climate in the face of the rapidly changing climate we exist in right now?
Mm-hmm.
Big question.
Yeah, two pretty hard questions.
Yeah, no pressure.
No pressure. Yeah, I mean, when I think about, and so this goes maybe to the question of wealth creation and how do we define wealth and how do we think about wealth in as it relates to indigenous economies, tribal economies, and so on. And so I think there are, I mean, with the advent of our digital economy being able to kind of connect, and then we also have to talk about like the lack of bandwidth in rural America and tribal America in our indigenous economies, but or on our indigenous lands. But I'd say that we need to be thinking more creatively. And I'm biased. This is a design problem, right? How do we design new economies? How do we think about ways in which we have shared economies within indigenous communities, right? We don't necessarily have to rely on the all-empowering dollar bill and really rethink what does it mean to lift up tribal knowledge or cultural knowledge maybe a prime example is how we steward our forests and forest fires and do control burns, like all these ways of kind of indigenous knowledge and indigenous thinking and how that can contribute to an economy rather than what we've historically kind of fell back on from a Western or a Euro-Western standpoint. And I think that's one way to kind of think about our economies, especially when it comes to Alaskan Native, Hawaiian Native communities that are maybe secluded from the main, main 50 states or 49 states. And then the kind of conversation around cultural nuances, how do we tie together those aspects? I think I've been giving a training for the past 3 days with a couple of colleagues and just really thinking that these are complex situations, and for every community there's a complex and nuanced solution, and it really has to be reflecting the nuances of the community and allowing the communities to be in charge of these processes rather than outsiders. I always kind of say that I'm an outsider in any community I work in, unless I'm working in my own community or here in Santa Fe. Like, how do we start to understand that more specifically? maybe I answered your question or started to.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Maybe just to kind of follow up to that response of, we talked about like how traditionally indigenous people have like, taken care of their land and how one might like steward land and forests, and also ways that indigenous knowledge can be preserved and passed on. I'm wondering if you can kind of bring us to one of your construction sites and then kind of talk about how that knowledge is, how that knowledge manifests on a construction site or in the process of building, and the ways in which you interact with the community during the construction process.
Yeah. So while I was working at Santo Domingo, I learned a lot about adobe construction, right? Compressed earth block construction, adobe construction, and understanding the nuances of what it meant to introduce foreign materials to natural building processes. And I'd say that that was incredibly eye-opening. Right, I would say that in many ways, Pueblo communities had it figured out when it comes to kind of sustainable housing construction prior to Euro-Western contact, right? In the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, with the advent of cement plaster, communities moved away from the mud plaster, which basically you kind of see on the wall, to a cement stucco or a cement plaster, which basically the kind of idea there was that mud plaster, you needed to patch and kind of take care of the home on a yearly basis, right? You'd have community gatherings or family gatherings that you would kind of work on this house, which is a living thing. And I think that idea still exists today, that your house is a living object, and you need to take care of it. And I think in many indigenous cultures that is still relevant. But in the 60s, 70s, 80s, with the advent of cement plaster, that idea of kind of yearly maintenance started to go on the wane side. It started to go away. And what ended up happening, and you might have seen it in some of the slides, but structural failures started to happen, right? People weren't, not that they weren't taking care of the exterior of the home while they weren't, but those, because people didn't need to take care of the home, the plaster, it looked like it was in fine condition from an exterior, from a person looking on the outside in, or to the wall. Those walls started because during rain events, moisture got into the wall cavity, and those mud adobe bricks, which are mud adobe, right? That moisture inside the wall ended up turning back to dirt. And so basically you have two cement plaster walls with nothing inside, no structural ability inside. And so what started to happen is those walls started to kind of fall apart. And so we saw this all over the village, right? Adobe walls, roof failures. And so kind of going back to what does it mean to be taking off that cement plaster and replacing with mud plaster or a lime plaster, all became pretty crucial to reintroducing those traditional ways of home construction within the historic village. And I'd say that, I mean, today I live in an adobe home, which is kind of it is a mud adobe home. And that kind of feeling of kind of understanding that construction type is pretty amazing to learn from, and understand how to potentially, and I'm not saying I know everything about Adobe construction, but having that little knowledge, that kind of little knowledge of Adobe construction has kind of helped me understand what does it mean to be thinking about this from a indigenous standpoint. Another example is work that we haven't done, but work on the Thunder within the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation in Porcupine, South Dakota. The ability for indigenous knowledge holders to kind of be in control of the construction process is actually empowering, and the ability to kind of be in control of that process and share that with future generations, and really build the skilled and unskilled labor forces from a low fab or a locally fabricated kind of standpoint really is about developing economies in rural places, rural spaces. And so how does that then get translated to future generations? And like I was saying earlier, like all this knowledge could be passed on and really develop an economy that really reflects the values of the community, rather than having to be reliant on external contractors coming in to build on reservation, which is then that money goes off reservation rather than staying on.
Have you found in your work with various Native nations that there's been code challenges to incorporating indigenous architecture? For example, like did someone, like, is structural adobe bricks not accepted as a safe material, or the like?
Yeah, the code conversation is another complex one. Also thinking about natural materials or historic materials, right, is another complex one, right? I'd say that, right, the first thing that when we go into communities and we have a community engagement meeting or we have a community meeting, sometimes the first comment that comes from the community member is like, we don't need an engagement meeting, we just need housing. The housing is so dire that we'll take anything you'll build or you design. And because those situations are so dire, like thinking about the community is not afforded the opportunity to think creatively or in depth about what is a design opportunity around housing, because the need is so dire. And so just give me housing, give me a trailer, give me something that I can get into so I don't have to live in a wet, cold climate or unhealthy situation. Well, and that's hard, trying to reframe the conversation to think about, well, this is actually an opportunity to think more creatively about what long-term housing, sustainable housing, culturally relevant housing can be. That's a big conversation. The code conversation is also an interesting one, mainly because when we think about the dynamics around building codes, health and safety, especially when we're kind of going through architecture as a profession, right? It is a profession, and people get licensed to kind of think about the health and safety of the buildings that we inhabit. Well, on reservations, many tribes don't have building codes. There are no building codes, or there's no way of enforcing those building codes if there are building codes. How do we, when we think about building codes, who are the individuals inspecting buildings that are providing certificate of occupancies? And a lot of the times it's those services, a state inspector, a city inspector, a fire marshal. And when you think about the nuances about how are they paid, when it comes down to it, it's your city tax, it's your state taxes. And on tribal lands, there sometimes, I won't say all tribal communities, but many don't have those tax structures to provide those job opportunities. And so hence you don't have these inspectors that are actually going out and inspecting. And so, and in many ways, sometimes tribes look at building codes as an infringement on their sovereignty, right? This is a Western way to be thinking about health and safety. This is not an indigenous way. And so a lot of the times our conversations are that this isn't an impingement on tribal sovereignty, but this is really a way to kind of think about health and safety within your community. And because there's tribal sovereignty, you have the ability to define what those building codes look like, and what does a culturally relevant building code look like for your community. What is a Santo Domingo building code? What does a Northern Cheyenne building code look like? What does, and really allowing the community to be defining what those building codes look like, because it really is a health and safety situation in many of the communities that we're working in.
There's a question from the audience, which you in part touched upon. Can you talk about the limits of engaging traditional architectural techniques such as Adobe from a governmental perspective? HUD is not able to support this.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that HUD isn't able to support natural building. I mean, they supported a lot of the rehab at Santo Domingo, right? That was Indian Community Development Block Grant Funds. That was Indian Housing Block Grant Funds. HUD is, I mean, it goes back to NAHASDA, like the policy that allows the housing authority and the tribe to allocate the funds to housing priorities that they see are priorities, as long as the end user is within they qualify for affordable housing, or they're under or in an income bracket that allows those funds to be spent down. And I'd say that, and I wouldn't dwell on indigenous building techniques. It's not to say that we can't build out of structural insulated panels, that we can't build out of different types of stick frame construction. I think all those options, or modular, right? I think all those options are on the table when we think about design. It's really, what is a design process? What is a way of thinking about construction, and how does that relate to the issues or the problems that the community is facing? Maybe the right answer is Adobe, or mud earth, compressed earth blocks, or Adobe bricks. Sometimes maybe it's an enhanced Adobe, right? Maybe it has a cement aggregate that actually allows the mud brick to kind of solidify and become more resistant to water. I'd say that understanding the construction processes and what is available locally and from an affordability standpoint, you have to weigh all those options, and that should be happening early on in the visioning, planning, pre-development phases of housing development.
Another audience question that fits in quite well with that: what are the financial strategies employed to fund low-cost housing in some of your work? What has worked and what has not worked? Biggest challenges and biggest successes? And I'm thinking that the question is framed less toward the federal scale initial funding and more like, how do you make those decisions about to use prefab trailers or not, or to use Adobe or not, or in a I guess in a different climate, completely different set of questions, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the financing one. I mean, and during our training this past week, we that conversation around financing came up quite a bit. And like, how can we fund this work? Where can we fund this work? And the easy answer and the non-complex answer is that it really depends on the location, the region, and the community, right? And that's not to say that we can think more strategically about complex financial models. And so let's just take a case example of maybe Santo Domingo, right? Where that early investment was through the low-income housing tax credit, right? It's the low-income housing tax credit is probably one of the primary investment models or funding models that allows housing to be developed across the United States, outside of the community development block grant funds, which basically just is for a certain income bracket population. And so how can start to leverage that in a way that allows you to serve a certain small percentage of the population. And so the low-income housing tax credit tied with community development block grant funds is one method of developing affordable housing. I'd also say that in Indian country in particular, we have the HUD section, the Section 184 Loan Guarantee Program, the HUD section, which basically means, and the nuances there is it basically allows for individuals who belong to a federally recognized tribe to apply for a mortgage. So the HUD 184 loan product is just your typical mortgage, which allows you to build on reservation and off reservation. And it's guaranteed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so, but it's not the Department of Housing and Urban Development that's writing that mortgage, right? It could be a traditional bank. It could be a bank that provides that mortgage, that loan product, that mortgage. And so I look at that as a pretty inventive and creative way to scale affordable housing, or maybe even not affordable housing. It's for those that maybe don't qualify for HUD housing under the HUD standards, but that might not be able to get your more traditional loan product from the Bank of America or the Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo's out there. But the HUD 184 is a pretty creative tool to build and develop housing. Now, if we were to kind of even get further, if we were to complicate things even a little bit more further, looking at ways in which we scale that, right? So those that can take out a HUD 184 are not only individuals, but in some instances, the housing authority. So they can take on a large HUD 184 loan. Let's say they want to build 15, 20, 40 homes. They can take out a loan to build those units and then transfer those mortgages to a qualified buyer. And so basically they're acting as a developer, and then they're passing that mortgage over to a homeowner. And by the way, if they have operational funds or funds that they can, discretionary funds, they can do down payment assistance, right? What does it mean to be giving a grant out for $5,000 to pay towards down payment, or 15? And maybe if they do qualify, if they are low income and they do qualify under the HUD standards, maybe they can get that down payment assistance through the Indian Housing Block Grant Fund program. And so I think there's many different creative ways to think about housing development. And I'd say that cities too can think about this in creative ways as well. So moving outside of the HUD 184 loan product, what does it mean for a city housing authority to do down payment assistance for those that want to create home ownership? I think the interesting thing here is that we shouldn't be using federal funds to pay for the whole house, right? The whole house shouldn't be paid for through federal funds. We should find ways to kind of spread that through many units, and then kind of think about passing the bulk of the costs to individuals in a debt capital means, right? What does it mean to be building equity, building wealth over time? And that will allow us to kind of spread out those federal funds among many units rather than investing in one or two units holistically. And so that's where I think it gets exciting from a development standpoint, from a financial standpoint. And then maybe there are creative delivery methods from a construction standpoint, a design standpoint, that allows you to scale that, right? When we think about modular, or we think about modular construction practices, what are ways in which we can get a scale of economy that allows us to drive down overall development costs? And that's another conversation.
Thank you. There are questions coming in, which kind of pull us in all sorts of directions, but this one is asking kind of about your engagement with a community when you may consider yourself an outsider. Can you talk about applying cultural traditions when you would consider yourself an outsider of a community in a way to give the community their voice in this process?
May I actually hop on that and piggyback it with another question we have, which is the dynamic of being a familiar outsider, which I think as NOMAS, many of us are POC, and sometimes we'll need to engage with communities that don't have a similar, like they don't at all have the same experience, but like we may be closer than other groups. So I'm curious if you could add that layer on to your answer as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a interesting one. I think I'd start with this idea around the land acknowledgement, right? The ability to kind of open up a conversation with acknowledging one's biases, one's kind of acknowledging place, acknowledging community, acknowledging a community's knowledge is important, right? And in many instances, the initial conversations during a community engagement piece is, I acknowledge that I'm an outsider. I acknowledge that while I might be indigenous, I'm not indigenous to this place. You are the knowledge holders, and I'd say that that coming from that place of vulnerability, coming from that place of grounding the conversation. Yes, I might have a skill set that you don't have, but that doesn't put me in a power position, or doesn't put me over you all as knowing your community. And so how do you frame that from an acknowledgement standpoint? And I'd say that I fall back on that quite a bit in terms of how do we kind of set the tone to ensure that people can contribute to the conversation from a perspective of power rather than you know more than me.
A question that we'd like to offer that is intended to elevate your voice if you'd like. So please don't feel any pressure if you don't want to engage with this question. But in your opinion, is it enough for MIT SAP and the architecture school to acknowledge unceded lands? And is there anything you'd be interested in seeing MIT or MIT Architecture Act in relation to reparations for indigenous communities or architectural pedagogy? Again, no pressure. You could take a second. You don't have to
pressure.
answer.
Yeah. Well, again, I think the land acknowledgement allows for the grounding of a conversation. It allows for folks to engage and set the tone for a larger conversation. I think in many ways it's a point of departure. It allows one to acknowledge place, to acknowledge a people, to acknowledge a community that has been disenfranchised, disempowered, and transferring that power back over to the community in some ways, even if they're not present, right? But yet I still do think it's like it is a drop in the bucket for what needs to happen, right? Okay, so what? You did a land acknowledgement, good for you. Now what's next? How can you take that land acknowledgement and push it forward? Like, and I'd say too that who does the land acknowledgement is also important, right? For not, and this is my own personal perspective, for non-natives to acknowledge the land in the kind of opening of a conversation, I think is more powerful than if an indigenous person, and it depends on the conversation, but what does it mean for non-natives to be acknowledging place, space, indigenous populations, and then using that as a means to invite others to the conversation. And so when we talk about, I wouldn't give my architectural education back for anything, right? What I learned is help me kind of understand from my own perspective how to engage in this conversation, right? Most of our educations are based in a Beaux-Arts, Eurocentro, Western context. That said, if I were in the academy, if I were teaching design studio, if I was kind of teaching architectural theory and or a seminar, I wouldn't teach it the way that I was taught. I would kind of reframe that in many ways to ensure that indigenous knowledge is right there with kind of the classics, or the kind of classical architectural theories that most architectural students get, right? When I came out to New Mexico and learned that there was a whole department at the University of New Mexico around indigenous design and planning, like where was this when I was in school? When I got to go out to Chaco Canyon and look at this amazing urban form that wasn't influenced by Western contact, why wasn't that part of my architectural history course? And so I would definitely be thinking and rethinking architectural pedagogy from the kind of perspective of First Peoples and Indigenous peoples, if that were to be the context in which I was kind of teaching from, or if I were to kind of give any thought to.
Thank you. Thank you for answering also to that question. And in some ways, you're also preaching to the choir. As a non-Westerner myself, I find myself kind of in a place where, you know, architecture doesn't reflect the culture that I come from, or the architecture with the capital A that I'm taught does not acknowledge other ways of making sense of the world, other ways of building a culture. So thank you for sharing that. And maybe one kind of slightly more philosophical question is that there seems to be sort of a tension between deeply kind of grounded and land-focused ways of thinking about the world, the kind of indigenous ways of thinking, and multi-generational thinking. That you know, there's this desire to learn from elders and pass that knowledge to the next generations, build homes that are maintained and taken care of and passed on. But then all of that happens in this capitalist society that is everything fast and cheap and unsustainable. And so it feels like we're kind of this, like, I don't know, trying to stay standing against the current. And I'm wondering kind of how you, does that relate to you? And if so, then how do you kind of operate in that as a designer, as an architect, and also as a Native American?
Yeah, I'd say there are contemporary practices when it comes to architecture. There are different ways about thinking about the built environment from an indigenous standpoint, and from an elder standpoint, right? One of my elders, Edna, who's here behind me, like she taught me what does it mean to kind of be part of a community, right? We never say goodbye. It's we'll see you later. And so, like, what does it mean to kind of learn from past generations, be present in today, and know that we're kind of part of a society that is much kind of larger than the individual, and then think about the future. And this is a concept that I've been trying to communicate to a couple of clients, but this notion around 7 generations is that we're constantly in flux, right? Your 7 generations is different from my 7 generations, is different from my elder's 7 generations. And so how can we be kind of moving within that space, but also living in the today? Many of our tribal youth love their iPhones just as much as non-natives. They're kind of colleagues in urban centers. This kind of idea around basketball is just as important in urban areas as it is in rural and tribal areas. And so how can we kind of understand society as kind of a civil society and engaging in conversations amongst one another? And I think the architecture reflects that, right? When we think about contemporary construction practices that can be informed by traditional ways of thinking. I lift up the example of the teepee, right? We're not going to build a teepee. Like that is an old typology, but we can learn from the teepee, right? The ability for the form to put its back towards western prevailing winds, and during the winter months, the skirting of the teepee to kind of protect it from cold weather, and then its ability in the summer to open up and pull back the hide and allow for natural ventilation and cooling of the unit. Like, how does that translate in a contemporary way? We won't be building teepees, but those kind of concepts can translate into contemporary practice, whether it is modular construction, more kind of off-site structural insulated panel construction, or stick frame. Like, what does it mean to be implementing these processes from an indigenous perspective that lift up indigenous knowledge, but in a contemporary way? And I think that's important for community members to know, elders to kind of have a voice in, and for us to be in conversation. And I kind of pause and leave you with this kind of idea around that these are issues that not only natives are facing, but also non-natives, and how do we work in community together? How are natives and non-natives working collaboratively to solve the issues in rural areas and tribal areas and urban areas? How do we kind of work together in a civil society that allows us to kind of achieve these goals rather than individualistic goals and siloing the conversation? So it's much more about the community conversation rather than the individual conversation.
Thank you so much. We have reached the end of our time, unfortunately, and I think that's a kind of a hopeful maybe tone to wrap the conversation, thinking about this as not my problem, your problem, but kind of our shared concern for the world we inhabit and the shared kind of lands that we need to take care of. And I think Zia will join us as well to wrap up the conversation.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Joseph, for giving us so much of your time this week. We've really enjoyed having you as a part of our community. Thank you to Nari and Amanda for fantastic and amazing moderation of this ongoing conversation that I hope we carry back into many other meetings that we have as an organization and as a department. And thank you to everybody else for joining us this evening. Just a couple of closeout notes. We hope that you'll all join us tomorrow, April 30th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. EST for the Engineering Independence, Concrete Architecture in the Global South Symposium, which has been organized and developed by students and faculty from the department, as well as next Thursday, May 6th at 6 p.m. for SEAMS, Race, Architecture, and Design Computing, a lecture by computation alumna Felicia Davis in collaboration with the Design and Computation Group. You can see the full list of our upcoming events at architecture.mit.edu, and we hope to see you with us again. Have a great evening.